Michael McMullan. Welcome once again to the WPBSA official podcast, where for the last episode in the current series, we're looking back on a World Championship that doesn't actually get talked about very much, but for me was actually quite a significant tournament in that whole 1980s era, and in particular in what was to follow for the remainder of the decade. It's the 1987 World Championship, and it's wonderful to be joined by the winner of that year's championship, Steve Davis, and semi-finalist Neal Foulds. Guys, welcome along. Thanks for joining us. And context is everything, really, Steve. So let's start by talking to you about what had led up to 87, which was, of course, the two final defeats in 85 and 86. Prior to that, you'd been so accustomed to winning that really, apart from that blip against Tony Knowles, you dominated the early part of the 80s. But having lost those two finals, there was perhaps a sense out there that maybe your dominance was slipping, that perhaps your time of winning world titles was over, and that you weren't going to end up with the total that people had expected. Can you remember, did you have any of those thoughts at the time?
No, funnily enough, whilst the World Championship is 100% pressure anyway, that's your foot to the floor of feeling under it as a snooker player. I have no real recollection of individual matches, but what I do remember was that I had nowhere near as much trepidation or unease, if there was any, coming into the final. And the fact that probably Joe had beat me the year before took the pressure off a bit. So I felt a lot more comfortable playing Joe the second time around. And so my only real memory of that final was the fact that I felt more like it was a fair fight, that I wasn't the overriding favourite that put me under any type of pressure. And I think what we've seen from this year's World Championship was so many people who were considered to be the favourite then not producing and the underdog winning. And I think this thing about being favourite and underdog is whilst we know it, is massive. And it absolutely defines some matches, and anybody that can override that feeling and what they put under their own what they put on themselves as expectation. If you can play for the vast majority of your career without taking that into account, then you've done very well, because it does weigh heavy on you sometimes. It doesn't necessarily, it could be for a whole season, you may feel that pressure, or it could be for an individual match. But I do remember playing Joe the second time around that, let's just go to war, just have a fight, rather than I'm expected to beat somebody and then dealing with that on your shoulders.
Well, we'll talk a bit more about that final when we get to it later on. But going into the 86-87 season, obviously Joe was world champion and you were coming in off the back of having lost the final. Having waited a whole year to try to put things right after the disappointment of 85, and then it still didn't work out, was 86 perhaps even a bigger disappointment than 85, or was there not much difference between them?
No, I think I can understand how people would possibly, or like sort of, if you're analysing a season or something, you would be viewing it as all about the World Championship. But for me, and I don't know about Neal, I mean, I'm sure it's about the next tournament you're playing in. So thinking of that period of time, I lost to Dennis in 80. I've just got to look at that. I just look at that cow you sent me. 1 second to remember the year. Hold on, I'm just going to get this up now because it's very important that I get this up.
Yeah. Well, this is only an audio, Steve. So while you're looking,
sorry. I'm sorry. Oh, apologies.
Dennis sent you a picture. Dennis sent you a picture of a cow that he saw recently, which had the number
1985 on its arse. Yeah. Any chance to get 1985 into the equation, Dennis would do it, obviously. So losing to Dennis in 85. The whole year the next year wasn't about rectifying the problem in 86. It was about the next tournament, and then the next tournament, and the next tournament. And then so somewhere down the line, the World Championship comes on the horizon and you try and get ready for it. But it's this weird thing about you're sort of defined by the World Championships. But actually, as a player, you're just playing in the next match. So when you're analysing it historically, you obviously put more emphasis on how this is, but you're just dealing with your day-to-day playing and what your form's like for the next match. So
Well, Neal,
we
let's
don't
come
have
to
this.
you.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to come to Neal actually about that, and it's interesting you saying that, because I think at that time, because there were so few ranking events, every ranking event felt like an absolutely massive major occasion, and the World Championship perhaps didn't stand out quite as much. But Neal, what we'd seen by the start of that 86-87 season, there had been a new wave of really good talent turning professional, late 70s, early 80s, people like Terry, Griffiths and Jimmy White, and obviously Steve at the forefront of that. But by now, there was a new wave coming through. Guys who had turned pro in their teens, around the mid-80s. Obviously, Stephen Hendry would emerge as the leading light from that, John Parrott as well. But you, Neal, were really the first of that next wave to break through and become a top player. This was your first season as a top 16 player. And remarkably for the time, the first ranking event you played as a top 16 player, you won it.
I was actually looking at, because I knew we were doing this, I had a little look back to that season. And as you say, there were 6 ranking events, and it was the perfect start for me to have won one of those, having beaten Cliff Thorburn in the final. Yeah, it was very odd, because looking back at that season, there was a lot of invitational events for smaller fields, but the rankings were kind of slow to react. So I wasn't in any of those. I was actually in them further down the line a couple of years later, when I wasn't in the same kind of form. I'd lost my game a little bit then, and I was dropping down the rankings, but I was in everything then. Whereas that year, that I wasn't in very much. I think I played in the Masters for the very first time that season. So the rankings and everything else that was going along with it were 2 completely separate things for me. But yeah, I mean, I picked up the first ranking event. I probably should have been in the final of the very next one, because I should have been in the final to play Jimmy White. But strangely, Rex Williams played some of the best snooker of his sort of later life that week, and he won the last 3 frames to beat me in Reading in the Grand Prix, and lost to Jimmy White in the final.
That was incredible. Rex brought that out of the hat. So that was like a magician turning back the years, wasn't it?
Well, he beat you as well, Steve, didn't he, in the quarterfinal?
It was an astonishing performance by a guy that we knew could play billiards, but we didn't know he could play snooker.
Well, he was 53 years of age, so it was remarkable for him to do that. But just on the BCE, before we move on from that, Neal, the BCE International that you won in Stoke-on-Trent, it's hard to convey to people now, isn't it, who weren't around in the 1980s. If you won a snooker ranking event like that, where there were probably 10 million people or so watching it in Britain alone on television on that Sunday afternoon, it was massive news, and you suddenly became a huge name.
Yeah, I think even though Steve is on this podcast, I think that we used to look over our shoulder to see who Steve was playing. And he lost that week to Eugene Hughes, which was something of a surprising result. I remember that match was taken off at 4 each. And I remember going into my dressing room, and Steve was just sitting there, like, actually with his feet up on the bench, 4 each with Eugene Hughes. And I thought, well, he probably did us all a favour here, Eugene, and win. Now, Eugene was a really good player, don't get me wrong, and I ended up beating him. But it was kind of handy not to have to play Steve in that event, really. That's what it felt like at the time for me.
So you won the BCE, and as we said, you were a frame away from getting to the final of the Grand Prix a few weeks later. And then the third ranking event of the season was what was still actually known as the UK Open at that time. And the early days of that tournament were actually dominated by something that happened off the table when it emerged that Alex Higgins had assaulted one of the officials. He'd done some damage to a door at the Preston Guildhall. He ended up being banned for a few tournaments, got a massive fine at the time. But Steve, you probably saw as much as anyone of Alex's behaviour at that time. And I'm guessing when the news came through that all of that had happened, Steve, it was probably no great surprise to people.
Well, I mean, I didn't know Alex, but I certainly had to interact with him at tournaments and also exhibitions that we might get booked together to do. And I tried to keep my distance in as much as he sort of scared me a bit. So all of the antics that happened around him, I suppose I look back and sort of think, oh, like it was like, I'm pleased it wasn't me involved, because it seemed like, it was a hard enough game to play anyway. without putting extra heat on yourself with all of the other activities that were surrounding it. So it all seemed like a bit surreal that all these things were happening to Alex, because I wasn't from his era. So therefore, I didn't know him at all. I then became good myself and had to play him without hanging out with him socially. And then this person who was sort of unfortunately slowly disintegrating in front of our eyes, who was this brilliant player, but most of the time was self-destructing. You just hoped you didn't play him. You hoped you didn't have to interact with him. And that was how I felt about it. Even though the matches you played with him would be exciting because there was an interest in them crowd-wise, it was always sort of tinged with this sort of the fact that you didn't know what you were going to have. And I always felt that he was the equivalent of me to what in the cartoon world, of the cartoon that was out at the time, which was Taz, the whirling dervish from, and wherever Alex went, he left a trail of destruction behind him, of people shocked at what just happened. And all of a sudden, we had to deal with that as well. Referees, officials, players. So he was like the sort of the hand grenade that was put into tournaments back then. And obviously he'd been in invitation tournaments, and we all had to deal with that. And yeah, I have sort of like, mixed emotions about my memories of playing Alex. And I think maybe the Rack Pack, which was the thing on iPlayer, was a pretty good folklore summary of how it all panned out. But it was tinged with sadness as well as being funny at times. So, the association had to deal with him. This person who was just like, not playing by the rules, licking the white ball, taking his tie off. He loved being a rebel. And for that reason, we all loved that part of it, as we all like a rebel. But from the playing perspective, you just knew if you were going to play him that it was going to be hard work. And it's not just hard work because he could be hard work, but also the crowd that came along to watch him would be hard work. And it's hard to try and explain to snooker fans now who have, who go to see Ronnie O'Sullivan play, and they're pretty vociferous when they come to see Ronnie O'Sullivan. But I'm sure Neal will agree. The people that used to come to watch Alex Higgins were another breed.
Yeah,
that they were like, they had a certain amount of him in them, and there was a nasty atmosphere sometimes that happened. Not saying that Alex was nasty, but the people that came along, they were much more vitriolic than any Jimmy White fan or Ronnie O'Sullivan fan. It was as if they came out of the woodwork and you had to deal with them. And the only way you could probably to know you'd done your job properly was if you kept the crowd quiet. But if you didn't, they'd get on top of you, and that was quite exciting, but also could be overawing as well.
It's funny you talk about the association having to deal with him. It's often said he was banned for 5 tournaments, which is technically true. But one of those was the Canadian Masters, and he wasn't ranked high enough to be in that anyway. And another one was the European Billiards Championship, and he wasn't playing billiards at that stage. So he was actually only banned really for 3 events, but that was a significant amount in those days. Neal, it seems amazing that after what happened with Alex and assaulting the tournament director and all the rest of it, he was actually allowed to continue in the tournament. He won his quarterfinal, and then Steve beat him in the semis. But the other big story going on that week, Neal, was how well you were playing and the matches that you won, and you found yourself in the final. Now, this was a big thing because it was a 4-session UK final in those days. You were up against Steve, who was the most famous sportsman in Britain, a totally dominant figure within the game. Looking back, Neal, do you feel going into that you saw it as a chance to lay down a marker of how you could be and what a threat to Steve you could be? Or was it a case that playing Steve was so hard in itself that you didn't have time to think about all that?
No, I was very confident actually going into that match because I'd played Cliff again. I'd played Jimmy White and had a great match with him. I'd beaten John Parrott in the semi-finals, who after that gave me loads of problems as a player because he was such a good player, a world champion. But I felt that John was halfway beaten before he started in that match. I didn't think he thought that I was playing too well for him. So coming into the final, I really thought I was playing well enough. And I think I led something like 3-1. But then Steve got a hold of me in the evening session. And what I would say, and this is absolutely not an excuse because he was completely soundly beaten, I did something that I didn't think when I hear about it now, I just think, why did anyone do that? I actually changed my tip after the first day of the final because I thought it had gone hard. Now, what the hell is that about? Because I always think, why would anyone do that?
Thank God for that.
No, it made no difference, Steve. It'd gone hard in my mind, but I actually think, looking back, did it, or did I just lose my game and panic a little bit? Maybe that's what players do now. And it was, I got up early on the second day and tried to put some hours in, and I played a lot that week anyway. Didn't make any difference. Steve beat me comfortably. And I do remember afterwards, we had a drink in the hotel, and I said to you, Steve, I said, I changed my tip, after the first day. And you said, you did well not to mention that in the press afterwards. I said, well, I'm just telling you about it.
Wow.
But it was a mistake to do it. But ultimately, Steve strangled me over 2 days, and that's what happened.
I remember very little other than the fact I always remember. I think I went 3. You went 3-0 up.
Yeah.
Well, it was 2-0. Neal won the first couple of frames.
Okay, so regardless of the number of frames, when all of a sudden a new player comes on the block and gets off to a flying start, it's a shock to the system because you don't know what they're capable of. So I do remember vaguely that I look back and think, oh, I did well to do that, because that could have been a game where I got swamped. If say Neal had won the first 4 frames or 5 frames, and I got in a hole and couldn't get out of it, that's when all of a sudden you have these awful days where you get such a bad session you can never recover from them. So it's this thing that we always talk about in commentary and in the studio that we can't get away from. It's like we're like it's a saying, you never settle down until you get your first frame on the board. You can't quite quantify that to the general snooker fan, because until you do, you are not the same person. You're in free fall until it happens. So to get out of that final, well, we'll all have different views on it. Neal will have his own view on it, and and obviously, if all of a sudden things start to go wrong, you start to look at what's going. You start to not think it's the same cue. You got, or what if it's not the same tip, and these things happen. But let's say Neal had won the first 4, and then maybe that come out after the interval, and I'm still in bits, and I lose the next, and I'm now 5-0 down. Then Neal's tip isn't the same problem as it was when I got my feet going, and I started to pot a few, and it's we've seen players like Ronnie O'Sullivan biting a tip off at the World Championship, and players totally losing the plot from being looking great the round before. The next minute they've absolutely lost it. So we all know what that's like. I mean, I remember my tip a bit falling off it. The tips can sometimes, when you get a bit low down sometimes, or you miscue and a chunk a foot fell out. I remember during the World Championship cutting my tip off in an interval and turning it round 180 degrees so I could use the bit that would be the bit that I would have been playing topspin with, that still had some meat on it, because your tip would be lower down on the screw back part. And that's what the things you have to do sometimes. But of course, why not have a tip that's in good condition before? Because you get into your brain gets in a weird thing just in the build up. The week before, you want the same tip on that you're comfortable with.
See, I hadn't thought about what Steve was saying there, because he's right. When you've got a match that long, and I've never played a match over 4 sessions, there is plenty of time for you to worry about things that you wouldn't normally worry about. I mean, I remember that night I said, I'm going to have to change my tip. My dad was up all night trying to... Stupid thing to do. But, I mean, I think you've got more time for things to think about things that can go wrong in those very long matches. Because there's no other 4-session matches now, are there, but for the World Championship, semi-finals and final. And, I think that all of that plays a part in how you think. And the further I got behind, the more I felt that was a problem, really. And come the evening session of that second day, Steve was a long way in front, and I don't think I even potted a ball in the 2 frames.
That's right,
or something like that. I thought, well, he's He's thoroughly beaten me. But I went into the match very confident that I could win. I must say that.
Well, it was 16-7 in the end. And as you rightly say, Neil, there were only 2 frames on the final night. You didn't pot a ball in either of them, but basically it was gone by then. And Steve, it continued a pattern, really. And indeed, the pattern will go on after that. You think of the 83 World Final against Cliff Thorburn, the 89 World Final, perhaps most famously against John Parrott. And I can think of at least 3 big 2-session finals, Steve, in which you whitewashed your opponent. And the thing is, at the time, it was obvious that you enjoyed that, not just beating people, but absolutely destroying them. Do you look back now, Steve, and think, wow, I was really hard in those days and very merciless?
Yeah, well, I tell you what, I enjoyed. I think I enjoyed the challenge of what was presented to you in whatever shape. I don't think anybody likes being the out and out favourite, but you have to deal with that. I felt that when you had a big lead, it was nowhere near as easy as people thought to keep that lead going. And on occasions, there's one that's printed on the back of a cow's arse that Dennis has sent me. I could show you the photo, but this is not a Zoom meeting. On occasions, it went wrong. But a lot of times, I was able to keep my lead. And I had some very big leads to protect. But the way to do it is not to try and protect it. You've just got to keep on pressing forward. So I enjoyed the relentlessness of it. It wasn't about necessarily pummeling your opponent. It wasn't about the winning. Well, it might have been, but that's not what I was getting off on. The thing it was the challenge of it all and the thrill of the challenge. And actually in the moment of doing it, afterwards, you won. If that's how you've won the tournament, and that's great. But the excitement was while you're doing it. So I enjoyed successfully keeping the pressure on. Like just keeping it on your opponent without letting the opponent off the hook, but not in a nasty way, if that makes any sense at all.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, having a big lead wasn't for everybody. Some people couldn't have a big lead, and you see so often in snooker, a player with a big lead gets pegged back. It happens so often because you're in a different mode when you're a long way in front, like the long distance runner looking over their shoulder, and it takes a lot of effort, if not more, to keep that lead up than it is actually to get there.
Well, you loved the UK at the time, Steve, because that was the 3rd year in a row you'd won.
That was my favourite. That was so talking. What I was something that crossed my mind. Regardless of the history books talk about the World Championship and how you view your World Championship, coming up for the next one, I always put the UK Championship as a great yardstick for form. So I was proud of my 6 UK championships, and it felt like that was the Players' Championship to me. The one where that was there wasn't perhaps the excitement around it. And actually, if you look at the the UK Championship over the years, there's been less surprise winners of that than there have been of the Worlds.
Yeah, which that's absolutely true. And you won it 6 times, as you say. After that win in '86, everything sort of turned around for a while, didn't it? Because first 2 ranking events of the season had been won by Neal and by Jimmy White, and people were saying, oh, maybe Steve isn't going to be as dominant. Then you go and win the UK. A few weeks later, you win the Mercantile, beating Jimmy in the final, and it just underlined you were, again, going through a dominant phase. Were you aware during the 1980s, Steve, of how vast your fame was? Because people describe you as the most sportsman in Britain at the time. And it's true. I mean, you absolutely were. You were a huge figure. People said you were on the TV in the 80s more than Margaret Thatcher. But were you aware of all that? Or were you just too focused on the snooker to really take that in at the time?
I don't think you were in a position to be. I mean, we're talking about a time before social media where the people these days have sort of like a team behind them, and that wasn't the case back then. So I think we were much more naive in how we judged ourselves back then as people now would do, So, who'd have thought that Stephen Hendry would be putting up Instagram posts every day to promote his YouTube channel? I mean, the world has changed when Stephen Hendry is now a social media animal. I mean, I absolutely love it. But back then, absolutely not. So all I was doing was getting ready for the next tournament. In between tournaments, doing a certain amount of exhibitions, maybe some TV, radio, whatever, but I didn't have any time to stop and think about what was happening. The only time snooker players had back then, and I would imagine so, say for Neal, where more and more tournaments started happening, after the World Championship, there was a bit of a lull for 2 or 3 months. You could just do what you wanted. You could do exhibitions, or you could sort of take stock and have a holiday. That was the only time you really had to stop and think what is going on. The rest of the time, you were foot to the floor with a variety of things. So I was aware that I was doing loads of media stuff, but it never really affected me because there was always a tournament around the corner that I was trying to get ready for. And I was trying to grab my practice in between the other things I had to do. So all of these other things were a hindrance to my practice regime before the next tournament. So I never really lost sight of the fact that I was a snooker player, and I knew that it was popular and that I was on TV or whatever, but that it was irrelevant because it was just about practicing.
Neal, how did the other players at that time view Steve and his enormous stardom?
Well, I think
I'm not kidding, Steve. I mean, we all remember you were just a massive household name, way beyond snooker, way beyond sport. And I wonder, Neal, were the other players aware of that? Was there an aura around Steve as a result of all that?
Yeah, there was. I mean, I'd only recently, well, certainly not that long before that season, joined Barry. So I was involved in all of the things, along with obviously Tony Mio, and there was Terry. They were the originals, and then obviously Willie and Dennis came along, Jimmy afterwards. But when we went away to events, Steve was the best player of all of us. But Steve wanted us to know he was the most hardworking as well. Never mind the fame side of it. We used to go away, and Steve would be the one practicing all day. He'd be the one doing all that. And I think he used to want us to know, hey, look, I'm not worried about what car I drive. I'm not worried about anything else. It's about me putting the practice in. And all of that. So, yeah, we were aware of his fame, but it wasn't like it ever went to his head. He just wanted to beat you. That was really his thing. Whereas, let's be honest, we have seen a lot of people in sport and in snooker who get a little bit of fame. And I'm not saying it intentionally goes to their heads, but they stop practicing, stop putting the work in. Whereas Steve was never really like that. And that was always the problem. He wasn't. And Stephen Hendry was exactly the same, by the way. In that they were the best players of their era, but they worked harder than anyone else. So it was no coincidence they were the best players. So I think Steve was always making sure that everyone was aware of that all the way through. And I think, and that's how I feel being around Steve.
But Neal, you'd have been working hard as well, wouldn't you? You'd have been putting in hour after hour. I mean, So I don't see that. Sure. Yeah, and you would have been on the way up as well. So you'd have been probably putting in more hours than me.
Maybe. But I remember one time we were away in Hong Kong, actually, and I went out to do some shopping, and you were playing one shot, and it was I think you had the cue ball on the brown spot and the blue on the blue spot, and it was why you would put the cue ball on the brown spot to pop the blue into each corner. I went out shopping for 2 or 3 hours, and when I come back, you were still playing that same shot.
That's nigh on it's nigh on a half ball.
Yeah.
So I was practicing half ball shots.
You was, but I'd been shopping for 3 hours, and you were still doing it. When I came back,
the secret of why Steve won so much. As the season went on,
what did you buy? What did you buy, Neal?
Well, I don't remember, but I probably spent too much money, and Barry wouldn't have been very pleased with me.
Yeah. It was probably a whole stack of vinyl albums, although it looks like you've got plenty of those yourself now, Steve. But as we move towards Sheffield, Neal, the Mercantile that I mentioned there that Steve won, that was actually the only ranking event that season that you didn't do well in. You got to at least the semis and all the other ones. But the next one then was the British Open. Now, my recollection of it is Obviously, you played very well to win your title in Stoke at the start of the season. That you probably even played a little bit better overall at the UK when you got to the final. But that maybe actually the best form you showed was at the British Open, where you eventually finished runner-up to Jimmy. What's your recollection of that?
Well, okay, I'd like to address one thing there, because the tournament I did no good in was, now again, this sounds like an excuse, but it was actually just a point that Steve made. But I was with Barry, and Barry had me in the Ireland from starting off down in Cork, going further and further up Ireland over the whole week before, playing 2 exhibitions, one in an afternoon, one in the evening, with a guy called Eugene Crozier, who was taking me around, who Steve will remember. And by the end of the week, Barry had made a lot of use of me in all these different events. And I was flying to Manchester to head up to Warrington to play in the Mercantile. Well, I mean, after a week of doing all that, which doesn't sound much, but trust me, I hadn't practiced properly. I'd played exhibitions, couldn't pot a ball, lost to Steve Duggan, which was my bad result. But I realised then that there's a lot going in. You can't just turn up and play. You know, what I thought was going to just be a good thing to do and maybe make some money out of it. You know what Barry's like. He used to work you hard. I just lost my edge completely that week, and I lost to him. But then I think come the British Open, I got it back. Although I think I had a match where I was a long way behind. I think against Warren King, 4-1 down.
That's right, yeah.
And I thought I was going out, but I played quite well after that. And you know, I had a good semi-final against Knowlesy. But again, the final just proved to be a bridge too far. I led in the final, I think, 4-0.
Yeah, you did. And you were still ahead. It was 3 sessions. You were still ahead going into the last day. And Jimmy then just overtook you in the end. But you must have been so full of confidence, Neal, at that time, because as I say, apart from that one Mercantile, which you've now provided the explanation for 37 years afterwards, the confidence at that time, and the snooker you were playing was actually of a level that really we'd only seen from Steve, as I recall it, in terms of the consistency of performance and scoring. The confidence you must have had going into the World Championship, even though you were still only 23, first season in the top 16, it must have been off the scale.
Yeah. I don't know. I didn't feel that confident really going into the Worlds, but I think that again, I realise how long these matches are. Going into the World Championships, getting through the early rounds, and then you get into that one table setup. I have a lot of admiration for the guys who could just pick themselves up, like Kyron Wilson did this year. You know, I thought Kyron looked incredibly fresh all the way through that final. He didn't look tired. Whether he was, I don't know. But I was struggling a little bit. I had 1 or 2 health issues. And I played Joe. And even the thought that in that semi-final where Joe, I think the third session he pulled away from me, the thought that I had to play Steve in another best of 35 over 2 days didn't fill me with the kind of pleasure it should have done, actually. Maybe the UK final had made me feel that way. But after what felt a long championship for me, and this is the same every year, it's no different to anyone else goes through, don't get me wrong. You know, I lost out in the third session to Joe and then didn't end up playing in the final, obviously. But it's a very hard tournament to keep your concentration for, I think. And I think my confidence drained a little bit during the course of that semi-final.
Well, we'll come to that semi-final in a bit, but just going back to the start of the championship, on the opening day, Joe Johnson obviously hadn't had a great season as world champion at all, and a lot of people thought he might lose his first match to Eugene Hughes. He was 6-4 down in that one. He got through in the end 10-9. But we've seen that so often, Steve, that defending champions at the Crucible, particularly, as we know, first-timers, they often get beaten in the first round. Even when they get through, it tends to be very, very close. So what is it, Steve, as someone who's experienced it so often, what is that like going in? We know it's the tradition that you play the first match as defending champion. Why is that so hard? And why have there been so many instances over the years of defending champions finding that first day one of their toughest matches?
Well, I think there's a lot of build-up in your own mind as it gets closer. So whilst I was saying earlier about, during a season, you're just thinking about the next tournament. As the World Championship starts to loom on the horizon, you do start to think about it. You start to analyze your own form a bit more. More and more people are talking about the fact it's going to happen. And it starts to it starts to come to a head a bit. And I think every player is possibly vulnerable in the first round at the World Championship, and if they have a bad session, they're really under it, because whilst the best of 19 isn't it's not a short match by any means. It feels short compared to the fact that you're going to be playing best of 25s the next round. And I think what happens is you get yourself in a bit of a state. Even if you are mentally hard, you still know that this is a potential banana skin, as we say very often. So you're hoping you don't have a bad session to start off with. You're not as comfortable as you would be in another event. It's very unusual going to the Crucible. It's like no other event there is, because of how it's so compact and so tight, that it feels like you need a match to actually get to remember what it's like. So this first round becomes this big mountain to climb before the rest of the mountain, which is big enough as it is. And on many occasions, people just collapse and they just lose the plot on the day, especially if it's a match in one day. Have a bad morning session if you've got to play them. And then before they know it, they're really playing catch up. And regardless of if they're the defending champion or the favourite for that match, the other person's got their tail up, and you're finding it so hard. And you may just be able to recover, but sometimes you don't recover. So I'm so many matches in the first round I think I could have lost, that I then won and then went on to win the World Championship. But it was a 10-9, a 10-8. I think I played Neal in one World Championship, 10-9, 10-8 or something like that. And then I think I might have won the World Championship that year. And I played John Virgo one year, I think, and just about got over the line. And then that's in my brain which matches they were. But
that's right. That was the following year, actually, after the year we're talking about. But even in '87, Steve, you had a big lead over Warren King, and he almost came back and put it up to you in the end. But you got the job done at 10-7, and Neal, you got through as well, and Jimmy got through, and most of the big names survived. There was one big name who went out, who we'll talk about in a moment. But one thing I do want to talk to you about, Neal, from that first round, we saw Murdo McLeod become the first Scottish player ever to win a match at the Crucible. He then lost to Joe in the second round, but he only just beat Stephen Hendry to it, because I think it was the very next day, Stephen won his first ever match at the Crucible, beating Willie Thorne. He went on to get to the quarterfinals and was a frame away from the one table stage before he lost to Joe. But people always say, Neal, about certain people, oh, he's bound to be world champion. He's definitely going to be champion in the future. He's going to be one of the all-time greats. And we always guard against it and say, you can never say that about anyone. What I would say is my recollections of how we saw Stephen in 1987, Neal, if there was ever a player that everyone felt pretty certain was going to go on and become world champion and one of the all-time greats, maybe it was Stephen at that time.
Oh, definitely. There's no question about that. I remember the match with Joe because I was likely to play Stephen. And, I'm being honest now, my career's long since over. I did used to sort of prefer to play certain players. They always say, who do you want to play in the next round? I don't care who it is. Well, I didn't like the look of Hendry at that point. I thought I'd rather play Joe. Of course, Joe beat me anyway. But, I thought, I don't really like the look at. He's such a good player. He was very difficult to read as well. He was quite aloof off the table. Didn't really want to speak to him. Maybe shy is the word. But yeah, there's no doubt that Hendry was going to be the real deal. There's absolutely no doubt, and you could see it a mile off that he was probably 20 years, maybe not 20, but maybe 10 years ahead of his time as a player. When the game moved, it was because Stephen had moved it forward, I think, to the next level. So yeah, I remember the match with Joe that he lost, and at the time I was well pleased because he looked a certainty to go a long way in the game, and as we know, he did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was just really about to start to lift off for him at that time. The one big name I alluded to there, who might have been considered among the front runners for the title, who didn't survive the first round, was Cliff Thorburn. An extraordinary match, 5-1 up against Dean O'Kane. I believe Cliff had tip troubles of his own. He then lost the next 9 frames and obviously was out of the championship then in the first round. And Steve, that cleared a big hurdle out of your path to the title whenever Cliff went out. It was often said at that time that Cliff was actually the hardest player in the game to play against and to beat. Was that how you saw it, Steve?
I can't really remember, but I would talk about a general trend towards the game changing. And we just talked about Stephen Hendry, who I didn't necessarily, I wouldn't say as strongly as Neal about the fact I knew it was going to happen, because I think players jump up levels. One minute that, from my memories of Stephen Hendry, he was easy to beat until all of a sudden he jumped up a couple of levels. I didn't have any problems with Stephen in one format. When in the mode before he learned a little bit more about the game, he was easy. Next minute, all of a sudden it changed, and then all of a sudden he jumped a level, and then he jumped up another level. Then all of a sudden, I couldn't beat him. Whereas Cliff Thorburn was from another era. So Cliff Thorburns game was old school. And it was becoming apparent, even though we didn't know it at the time, that the old school style was about to be superseded. So in a way, it's not surprising that that style of player started to struggle when the game became more aggressive. So I don't necessarily think I looked to Cliff Thorburn as a problem for me. In the same way as I never looked at Terry Griffiths as a problem for me. I enjoyed playing them. I enjoyed the challenge. I knew they were hard players, but they weren't the threat of an attacking new player coming through that was pushing boundaries and also asking questions of you. So I always felt that maybe Terry and Cliff were safe players for me because they didn't do the damage that future players were on the brink of doing.
Well, we talked there about the first round, and in the second round in '87, Steve, I don't know if you remember, you played Ray Reardon, and Ray actually led the match 3-1, and then you completely turned it round, and you were trying to win it with a session to spare because players always say that's a good thing. And Ray I think he made a century actually to take it into the last day, but you beat him comfortably. Turned out he never played at the Crucible again after that. You referred earlier to that movie, The Rat Pack, and there's a scene at the end where you're seen saying to Alex after he's had that match against Steve James that you had idolised him. Now, I think that was real poetic license because I don't think Alex was ever the sort of person you would idolise. It was always said that Ray Reardon was the man you looked up to growing up in the 70s. Was that the case?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, in as much as he seemed to be the guy who had the evil eye over the rest of them. He was the guy that seemed to be able to clear up on his opponent and dominate them tactically, and also walk around the table in a way that felt like he was exuding confidence. So he was the person that me and my father looked to think, what is he doing that the other players aren't? I wouldn't say that I necessarily sort of tried to model my game on him because I don't think you can do things like that. That's very difficult to try and analyze. But I did like the fact that he seemed to be in more control than some of the other players, and he did have a certain pause in his backswing, even though it was a pause and then a bit of a jerk afterwards. But generally, it was, at least he seemed to be in control of his cue, whereas some of the other players didn't seem to be at that time really in control of their cue action. And I loved the tactics. So I used to love playing him because I knew I was up against the tactical master. So yeah, he was he lasted. He stood the test of time because he was a great player. So he went further than his sell-by date, more than any player from that era.
Yeah, it's worth remembering, actually, as I say, that was the last time he played at the Crucible. The following season, he actually beat you 5-0 in the British Open, just before you won the Worlds again, which was amazing. But in '87, then you went on, Steve, to beat Terry Griffiths and Jimmy White, and then you were in the final. As for you, Neal, you'd beaten John Virgo, you'd beaten Dennis Taylor, then you beat Mike Hallett, and that, as we say, took you into the semi-final, where you were playing against Joe Johnson, and you've talked about that match. I remember actually last year, Neal, you and I walking around the Crucible Arena when it was down to the one table and me asking you what it was like to play out there. That turned out to be, in '87, the one and only time that you played in the one table setup. Was that a factor in the game at all, or did you just take that all in your stride?
Yeah, no, I tell you what did happen during that. Barry actually had come to Sheffield for the semi-final, Barry Hearn, and it was always me and my dad in the change room, and Barry would come in before the game. I think Barry was a little bit worried that that Steve wasn't going to win it, or maybe one of his own players. If it wasn't going to be Steve, he wanted it to be me rather than Joe, because he didn't want to sign Joe up like he had to sign Dennis up when Dennis won it. All of these things, and basically he kept coming in, came in at the start of the match and said, right, you just go there and do what Steve couldn't do last year to Joe in the final. And then we got to about 2 each, and then Steve, and then Barry kept coming in. He came in again, said, right, just try and win the next 4 frames if you can. Anyway, it just kept on going on like this. And I think at the point where after the first day, there was nothing in it. I think we might have been level after the first day. Then Steve, then Barry came in, and Steve, he'd been in to see Steve, I think, in his previous session. And he came in to see me. Right then, come on, Fouldsy, just win the next 4 frames. So that was kind of his pep talk all the time, which wasn't working because I wasn't winning 4 frames.
It's as easy as that, isn't it, Neil? Just go out and win 4 frames against the reigning world champion. Easy to do.
And then halfway through the 3rd session, I made a century at the start of the session, and then lost the rest of that session 3-1. And then he came in again, Barry, and he'd say, "Listen, you really could do winning the next 4 frames there. You know that, don't you?" I said, "Well, Barry, I'm trying to. I'm trying." And then when it got into the last session, I was in a lot of trouble. He just came in and goes, "Fouldsy, for Christ's sake, will you just win the first 4 frames?" And he slammed the door shut, and that was that. So that's what I remember about that match. Barry thought he was this wonderful sort of Dr. Stephen Peters type of lesson in how to win matches. But actually, he was just making the situation, well, not worse. It's me that lost the match, but there was not a great deal of inspiration from it, really. Just the 4 frames. I mean, anyone could have said that. And Joe was winning most of the frames anyhow. So clearly it didn't work. Yeah, I had a bad session and got behind, and Joe was the better player, and Joe was very popular in those parts, obviously, as a Yorkshireman, and the crowd got behind him. And I just fell away as the match went on, really. And maybe I wasn't as strong mentally as some of the other players at that time in those kind of long matches. I think maybe I was easily, my shoulders used to drop, perhaps, you know what I mean, when really other players might just find a bit more strength. But that's what I remember about that semi-final anyway, Of
course, if you'd won that match, it would have been another 4-session final against Steve, as you'd had in the UK back in November. Yeah. How do you think you would have got on, Neil? Have you ever thought about what might have happened if you'd played Steve in that 87 final?
Well, I don't know. Look, it would have had to depend. Put it this way: when you've lost a match, and I lost to Joe and decided not to play very well, so towards the end of it, I would have had to pick my game up for the final, which would have been a test. Because I'm thinking, well, having lost to Joe, now anyone that loses in a semi-final, I guess, and starts not to play very well towards the end of it, aren't thinking very positively about how they got to the final, how they would play, because I wasn't playing quite so well back then. I think I might have struggled to win if I'm being brutally honest, but we'll never know. But I just couldn't get past Joe. I'd played Joe a number of times, but he was quite an inspired player at the Crucible, wasn't he? Over those 2 years, played some good stuff against me in that match, especially on the last day. He's the kind of player that he seemed to play without any real obvious fear. And you look back at some of the players in that era, and before he ever became world champion, you knew he was a good player, but you never really thought that Joe was anything special. But the way how he played at the Crucible over those 2 years proves what a special player he was.
I mentioned at the start there about how I feel it's not often talked up enough, the significance of that 87 championship in terms of that era and what it ultimately led to. And Steve, I guess going into that season and that championship, it was all about, can Steve ever win a world championship again? Because he's lost it the last 2 years. As it turned out, by winning it in 87, your 4th title, you actually launched what turned out to be an even more consistent era in the world championship, because you then ended up winning the last 2 championships of the 80s as well. So by winning in 87, it was almost like starting your second wave of dominance.
Yeah, and I think what that shows is that you need to be positive in being optimistic in sport, because it really doesn't matter what's gone before. It's about how you're preparing for the next event. And I was probably coming into maybe my golden period of performance. Just because, I don't know, I wouldn't know about gymnasts or snooker players or tennis players or football. What is the prime part of your career, physically and mentally, and it would be different for different people. And the likes of Ronnie O'Sullivan, John Higgins, and Mark Williams have proven that you can go on a lot longer than people might have assumed beforehand. But it felt like that I was getting enough confirmation from other events, not just the World Championship event, that I was becoming pretty sure that I was, my game was even better than it was back in the early 80s. And the game was also transitioning into sort of like, more sophisticated game. And I was growing with that for that period of time. Stephen Hendry hadn't come to the forefront. So I had that 87, 88, 89 period for me felt like a dominant period. I don't know how many events I won compared to other years, but I did win the World Championship. But I remember feeling that I'd sort of come of age a bit more, maybe, and maybe the fact of losing a couple of World Championships meant that there wasn't so much heat on, and I think once again going back to this thing about expectation, what you put yourself under, how other people perceive you, that you can't really get rid of because it's friends and family and everybody, and it's an underlying thing. You know what the bookmakers are doing. You know it's in the air, so to speak. So you know where you are in the hierarchy of things, and all of a sudden you come into a match, and you don't know what's going to happen on the day, but you are either looking forward to the fight or you're going in with trepidation. And I think those two animals are different. So all of a sudden, coming in to play Joe the second time felt a lot easier to me than going in the first time for whatever reason. If I'd have played Neal in the final, who knows? You just don't know what would have happened. It also crosses my mind now I'm in the commentary box like Neal more often now, watching matches, looking at how much luck is involved. Especially in the early stages of a match, how that can actually change the equation of a storyline of a match. So whilst we look at the history books and go, oh, that was inevitable, Neal, Mike Hallett lost to Stephen Hendry in the Masters there must have been luck involved. It could, Mike Hallett could have won. So there's,
he was 8-2 up, first to 9, and two balls away from winning 9-2. Yeah.
Yeah, but luck, this luck element that you can't control, that we all are now trying to put into the jigsaw puzzle of history of how it was, as if we were some sort of machine that could produce the goods whenever. But you get back from a match, you go 3-0 behind in a match, you go 4-1 behind in a match, you get lucky and you win the next game. But on another day, you get swamped. So we're all sort of like telling a story about the past that doesn't account for the ball nudges you get and all the little things. You don't even remember them all. You never remember the good luck. You only remember the bad luck. And these things are like lost in history, that if you re-watched a match and you went, there's the critical point of that match, what would have happened if you hadn't have fluked that ball off a bump in the middle pocket? How much different would the storyline have been? And history would have been totally rewritten based on a kick.
Well, Steve ended up, Neal, winning his 4th World Championship at the end of that season. As it turned out, he won 3 of the 6 ranking events as there were, which meant that effectively after a slow start by his standards, Steve ended up winning as many ranking titles that season as everybody else put together. But you were certainly the best of the rest, Neal, in that 86-87 season. It was the absolute high point of your career. You shot up from 13th to number 3 in the world rankings, where you stayed for 2 years. How do you look back now on that period in your life?
Yeah, well, I do. I very rarely look back on my snooker now, because I think I'm out of the game long enough for the most part. Unless I'm asked, I will never, very rarely bring it up in the commentary or anything. Yeah, I played great snooker. I don't think I was mentally as strong as some of the other players. I think genuinely that was my issue. It's very interesting what Steve's saying before you conclude on that, though, because talking about luck, and it does play a part, and it's not always the kind of luck of one player against another player. I mean, for instance, that match Steve mentioned in '85, just where that was where Steve beat me narrowly. Now, had I won that match, the whole '85 final would have been a different story, wouldn't it? Had Stuart Bingham this year,
it wouldn't happen.
Had Stuart Bingham this year from 9-7 up not qualified, would Jack Lazowski or Ronnie ended up getting through the bottom half of the draw instead of Jack Jones? I'm not saying that's, but the kind of the story unfolds. Kyron Wilson this year was the best player, undoubtedly, but the some of the draw fell apart around him. He'd have probably beaten them all anyway. But luck does play a huge part, and fate plays a big part in things, doesn't it? And that is the case. And that season, that was my best season. And as I said earlier on, I got invited into everything for the next 2 seasons, all kinds of events, like the Carlsberg Challenge, that thing that was taking place in Dublin, all these events that I would never have played in before. But strangely, about a year later, I had lost all my confidence. I dropped down in the rankings provisionally, but the rankings used to change once a year. So I was in everything for 2 years, but not playing as well as I was when I was playing that year. So that was how things moved very differently in the rankings then. So yeah, I mean, it was clearly my best season. Strangely, I ended up getting back as a footnote to all of that into the top 8 again. And I think I was a much better player the second time around than I was that year, because I think it will hit me a little quickly. I got to near the top quite quickly. I found my limits against the likes of Steve and maybe Jimmy in that British Open final. But I was a more rounded player further down the line. I don't really think I knew how to deal with it. And if you could have your time again, and of course none of us can, I would have probably enjoyed it all and sucked it up a lot better.
Of course, you talk about all those events you then got into on the back of that season for the first time the following season. And Steve was actually connected with a lot of those, because one of them was the Irish Masters. We got to the final and he beat you. Right. He used to win that nearly every year. And of course, together, you played in the World Cup and you won that. And in fact, you won it again together with Jimmy for England the following year. But Steve, I'd like to come back to you just to finish with all this. And, the narrative developed in the 1990s. Once you had won your 6 titles, we know Stephen Hendry, he probably had a clickometer somewhere in his garage or his attic or somewhere ticking over because he was trying to catch your 6. We know the story's been there since 1999 of Ronnie trying to catch up with Stephen. And of course, he did catch up with him 2 years ago. And now the question is, can he overtake him? But it's all in terms of Crucible titles, because I think with good reason, perhaps we discount a lot of what went before in the early years of the World Championship. But when you got to 6, Steve, nobody else had even got to 2 yet in a Crucible sense. So were you doing the totaling up at the time? Were you aware of your total? Or again, was it a case of just being caught up in the moment? It was always about just winning the next one.
Yeah, no, not at all. I didn't even think about it. It was just the next event. There's a film that I've always felt is a really inspiring film to something. It's called the film's called Whose Life Is It Anyway? Is it? Yes, yeah. Whose Life? With Richard Dreyfuss is in it, and he's a potter, an artist, and all of a sudden in the first part of the film, he basically becomes a quadriplegic, and then in the film it's about him deciding whether he's got the right to turn the machine off, and it's a court case. And along the way, somebody comes in the film to try and talk him out of it, to say, okay, so you can't use your hands anymore, but you could be a teacher. And he says to the person in the film, you don't understand. It's not about that. It's about doing it. It's about the doing of it. And that for me is what snooker was. And I'm sure for every player, it's about actually doing it in the moment. And that's the driving force. And I've never, ever been, counting trophies or anything. It's about being in the moment, doing it. And that is the most beautiful moment you could possibly achieve. So the record books, the tournaments you've won are meaningless. It's about the next time you play and getting ready for the next event and the doing of it. And that's maybe where I had my strength in being able to do that and not judge myself and just enjoying that moment as not as an artist, but as sport and art are somewhat linked in as much as when you're doing it, your brain's in a different part.
And just one final thought from you, Steve. You know, you were a professional snooker player for about 40 years. When you look back on all the success, all the worlds you won, all the UKs you'd won, you'd done all that within 11 years of turning pro. So
Yeah.
you actually spent most of your career,
Failing.
No, I wouldn't say that. But certainly in the post-glory era, as it were. And it is all so far removed now. 1989 was your last world title. You'd won your last UK in 87. You did, of course, have the revival where you won the Masters with one last hurrah almost a decade after that. But looking back on it now, when you see the pictures of Barry running onto the Crucible stage and banging into you, and the 85 final in the black, and even 87 that we're talking about, and then the absolute hammering of John Parrott 2 years later, is it almost so far ago now and so far removed that it almost feels like it happened to somebody else?
Totally. But what I do remember is the moments of peace in your brain of playing the game. In a world where there's so much sort of things that are coming from outside, whenever you went to the practice table, whenever you played in a match, even though if it was nerve-wracking, when you were playing in the moment in the Crucible or in Goffs or wherever it was, Guildhall, when you were playing the game that you absolutely loved and you knew how to play it, obviously, you had these moments of wonderful moments of actually playing and enjoying it to an nth degree that the rest of it's irrelevant. So that's probably why even though I didn't like the 90s in many ways, I still enjoyed playing because I was still doing exactly the same thing. The outcome may not have been as good, and that was horrible for that time, but you were still doing what you were doing. And I think effectively that is why we all have jobs. We all do something because actually we all like our job or we like our hobby, whatever that may be. And if your hobby becomes your job, then you've had a result. So even though I can't remember anything about the 80s, I remember nothing about the 90s either. What I do know is that I really had a wonderful time because I was doing my hobby.
And Steve, now your hobby has changed all these years later, and looking into the summer, you're playing Glastonbury.
Yeah. So music, along with me and Neal have a joint interest in. We both like talk. I don't know about other bands, but so my musical hobby's sort of taken over a bit, and that's good fun to do. So so if Neal, if you come along to the Glade area in Glastonbury next month, we'll play a talk track. We'll play Life Is What You Make It. That's about it.
I'll give it some thought, Steve. I'll give it some thought.
What about you, Neal? I'm guessing you're not playing Glastonbury, a summer of watching cricket mostly, I guess.
Yeah, I'll be doing that. I'll be doing a few things, but I won't be, for the next couple of months, I won't be thinking too much about snooker because we've had a long spell. And as Steve said, it used to be a defined close season. I'm not sure if it's going to be quite as long, but I think everybody in the game after the World Championship deserves to put their feet up for a while.
Because Neal, how many months a year do you're foot to the floor all the time, aren't you?
Yeah, no, I've done quite a lot. I mean, I was away until yesterday. Well, after the World Championships and the World Seniors, I've been away for over 6 weeks solid.
Wow!
Because I was in Manchester for the mixed doubles and the tour and the whole world. But look, it's what you say though. I mean, I feel lucky to do it as a job because I can be doing a lot of other things that will be less enjoyable. Not every single day is enjoyable, clearly, but most of the time I try not to lose sight of how lucky I am to be doing it.
Okay, well, guys, that 1987 World Championship and indeed the whole 86-87 season, just speaking personally, that was the very point in time when I was starting to become mesmerized by the game, starting an addiction that's still going strong almost 40 years later. And you guys were very much at the forefront of all of that. So thanks for those memories and thanks for sharing your thoughts with us today on the WPBSA official podcast. And thanks to everyone who's listened and contributed throughout this series. We'll be back with more memories in the very near future. In the meantime, enjoy your summer away from the snooker and we look forward to next season. Thanks for your company. Bye-bye.